It was one of those evenings where everything sparkled. Crystal glasses, silver spoons, the floor shining like a mirror under the chandeliers. A grand charity gala was being held at the city's most expensive hotel. Expensive cars lined the entrance, and photographers waited outside to capture the arriving guests. Inside the ballroom, laughter mixed with the soft sound of live music and the hum of countless conversations. Waiters and waitresses moved quickly but carefully, balancing trays of champagne and fine dishes. Among them was a young woman named Lena. Her hair was tied neatly, her uniform pressed, her expression calm. To anyone watching, she looked like just another worker in the background. But her eyes, those gentle, curious eyes, kept drifting toward one thing. In the corner of the hall stood a grand piano, black and glossy, its lid open like a wing. A soft light from the chandelier reflected off its surface. Every time Lena passed by, she couldn't help but glance at it. Something about it pulled her attention again and again. She tried not to stare for too long. She had work to do: collect empty glasses, serve the next course, refill water. Still, her gaze wandered to that piano as though it were calling her name. For her, that instrument wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a reminder of something she once loved deeply, something she had buried years ago. Lena had studied music when she was younger. The piano used to be her world. Back then, she could spend hours practicing, losing herself in melodies. But when her father fell ill, her family needed help. Bills piled up and dreams had to wait. She left music school and started working in small cafes, then hotels, doing whatever she could to keep things going at home. She told herself it was okay. That life had simply gone another way. Yet every time she saw a piano, her chest tightened a little. That night, as she worked among people who barely noticed her, that old feeling returned, the longing, the ache, and the quiet wish that maybe someday she could play again. The man hosting the event was a famous tycoon known for his wealth and ego. He loved being the center of attention. He was the kind of person who enjoyed reminding everyone how important he was. His voice carried across the room. His laughter was just a little too loud. His compliments always sounded like he was talking about himself. As Lena placed a glass on the table near him, he noticed her pause, her eyes flicking once more toward the piano. He smirked. "You like that instrument?" he asked, loud enough for the people around to hear. Startled, she looked up, unsure if he was serious. "It's beautiful," she said softly, trying to be polite. He raised an eyebrow. "Do you play?" Her cheeks warmed. She nodded slightly. "A little," she whispered. The tycoon chuckled. "A little, huh? Maybe we should have you replace our hired pianist for a song." His tone was half joking, half challenging. The people near him laughed. A few clapped playfully, enjoying the idea of seeing a waitress at the grand piano. Lena forced a small smile and stepped back. "Oh no, sir. I couldn't. I haven't played in years." But the man wasn't letting it go. "Come on now. Don't be shy," he said, waving his hand as if he was being generous. "How often do you get a chance to play a piano like this? Let's give the lady a moment to shine." The crowd's laughter grew louder. Someone called out, "Yes, let her play. Let's see what she's got." Lena froze. She could feel all eyes turning toward her. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the embarrassment or the thought that they were laughing at her, not with her. She looked toward the hotel manager, but he was standing at the edge of the room, forcing a nervous smile. Clearly, he wasn't going to stop it. The tycoon was a big client. No one dared to refuse him. For a moment, Lena thought about saying no, about simply walking away. But then she looked at the piano again. It had been so long since she'd touched one. So long since her fingers had pressed against ivory keys. Maybe, she thought, maybe this was her only chance, no matter how awkward it felt. She took a deep breath. "All right," she said quietly. "Just for a moment." The crowd clapped and cheered, some out of curiosity, some out of mockery. The pianist, surprised, stood up and moved aside. Lena walked toward the piano slowly, her hands trembling slightly. The sound of her shoes on the marble floor felt louder than the music had been moments ago. When she sat down, she could feel the warmth of the spotlight above her. The laughter behind her faded into a faint buzz. For a second, she just stared at the keys. They looked both familiar and foreign. She placed her hands gently on them, feeling the smooth coolness under her fingertips. She didn't know what to play. She hadn't practiced in years. Her mind went blank for a moment, then a melody came back to her, a simple piece she used to love. It was soft, emotional, and full of life. Her fingers moved hesitantly at first. The first few notes were uneven, almost unsure. She could hear a few whispers from the crowd. Someone snickered quietly. But then something shifted inside her. The old rhythm came back, the muscle memory she thought was gone. Her hands began to move more freely, more confidently. The melody grew smoother, richer. Each note started to flow into the next like water over stone. The noise of the crowd began to fade, replaced by the rising sound of music that seemed to fill every corner of the hall. For a few precious moments, Lena wasn't a waitress in a uniform. She wasn't someone struggling through life. She was simply herself again, the girl who loved music, who believed in dreams, who used to close her eyes and let her heart speak through sound. Her fingers danced across the keys and a quiet calm spread through the room. The laughter stopped. The guests began to listen. Even the Tycoon, who had started this to amuse himself, leaned back in his chair, surprised. There was a warmth in her playing that no professional performer could imitate. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was filled with emotion, with a kind of honesty that made people forget where they were. As the last note faded, a hush settled over the room. No one clapped right away. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath. Then slowly someone began to applaud. Others joined until the sound grew into genuine applause, not the polite kind, but the kind that comes from being truly moved. Lena looked up, startled. For a second she didn't know what to do. Then she smiled, small, humble, grateful, and stood up from the piano. The Tycoon stared at her, clearly unsure what to say. His expression had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something like guilt or maybe awe. He hadn't expected this. No one had. The applause continued for a while, echoing across the grand hall. But for Lena, everything around her had gone quiet. She felt an overwhelming calm inside, a peace she hadn't felt in years. She realized she didn't care what the rich guests thought anymore. For those few minutes, she had remembered who she was. When she went back to her station, some of the guests smiled kindly at her, their earlier amusement replaced by respect. A few even whispered to each other, wondering how someone working as a waitress could play like that. Lena just kept her head down, a small smile on her face. Inside, her heart was still beating to the rhythm of the music she had just played. That night, after the event ended and the ballroom emptied, Lena stayed behind to help clean up. The lights were dimmer now, and the piano sat quietly in the corner again. As she walked past it, she paused and touched the edge of the instrument gently. "Thank you," she whispered, almost to herself. Then she picked up her tray, turned off the last light, and walked out of the room, her steps light, her heart strangely full. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet. The city glowed in the distance, alive with lights and noise. But for Lena, everything felt still. She knew life would go back to normal the next day. Early mornings, long shifts, tired evenings. But something inside her had awakened. Maybe it wasn't the end of her story after all. Maybe it was the beginning of something new. And though she didn't know it yet, the memory of that one song, the song that silenced a room full of powerful people, would soon spread far beyond that grand hall. The next morning came quietly, with sunlight streaming through the thin curtains of Lena's small apartment. The world outside was already awake, cars honking, people rushing to work, life moving on as if nothing extraordinary had happened the night before. But for Lena, something had changed. She sat by her little table holding a cup of tea in her hands. The sound of the piano from the previous night still echoed in her mind. She couldn't forget the feeling, the touch of the keys, the silence that had filled the room, the applause that followed. It all felt like a dream, one she didn't want to wake up from. For years, she had worked quietly, keeping her head down, believing that the part of her who used to play music was gone forever. Yet last night proved otherwise. That part of her wasn't gone. It had just been waiting. She smiled to herself, a faint one, before getting ready for work. At the hotel, things were unusually busy that morning. The staff whispered among themselves about what had happened at the gala. Word had already spread that one of the waitresses had played the piano and stunned everyone. As soon as Lena walked in, a few of her co-workers turned to look at her. One of them, a kind older woman from housekeeping, whispered with a grin, "You were amazing last night. Everyone's talking about you, Lena blushed. Oh, it was nothing, she said softly. Just a small thing. Small? The woman laughed. The manager's been talking about it all morning. The guests were impressed, even the boss's friends were asking who you were. Lena didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to attention. Most days she was invisible, a uniform in a crowd of uniforms. But now everyone seemed to know her name. When she went to the staff room, a few of her coworkers clapped jokingly. "Play for us again," one of them teased. "Maybe you'll be famous soon." She smiled shyly, shaking her head. "No, I think one song is enough for a lifetime." But inside she felt a strange warmth. For once, people weren't looking down on her. They were looking at her with admiration. It felt nice. Later that day, the hotel manager called her into his office. She walked in nervously, unsure if she had done something wrong. The manager, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, gestured for her to sit. "You gave everyone quite a surprise last night," he said, smiling. "I had no idea you could play like that." Lena lowered her gaze. "I used to learn when I was younger," she said. "It's been years since I played." He nodded. "Well, whatever you did, it worked." The guests were very impressed. Even Mr. Donovan, the Tycoon who hosted the event, called this morning. "He wants to talk to you." Her heart skipped a beat. He wants to talk to me?" "Yes," the manager said. "He said he'd be coming by later this evening." He sounded, let's say, very interested. Lena felt her palms grow sweaty. The memory of that man's smirk when he'd challenged her still stung. She wasn't sure she wanted to see him again, but refusing wasn't really an option. She nodded quietly. All right. The rest of the day passed slowly. She worked as usual, but her mind kept drifting. Every time she thought of the Tycoon coming to see her, she felt uneasy. She didn't know what he wanted. An apology, maybe? Or worse, another performance. When evening came, the hotel lobby buzzed with activity. Guests came and went. Luggage rolled across the marble floor, and the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. Then, through the glass doors, she saw him walk in. The Tycoon. He was dressed as impeccably as before. Tailored suit, polished shoes, confidence in every step. But his expression was different. There was no arrogance, no mocking smile. He looked serious, almost thoughtful. The manager greeted him quickly and motioned toward Lena. The Tycoon walked up to her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said quietly, "Miss, I owe you an apology." Lena blinked, unsure she heard right. "I shouldn't have embarrassed you last night," he continued. "What I did was childish. I thought it would be funny to see a waitress play the piano. I didn't expect," he paused. "I didn't expect what you did." She didn't know how to respond. The memory of everyone laughing at her still hurt, but the honesty in his voice surprised her. "It's all right," she said softly. "You didn't know." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're very talented," he said. "I've heard many performances, but yours was different. Real. It wasn't just skill, it was feeling." Lena gave a small smile. "I used to play when I was younger. I stopped when my father got sick. Life changed." The Tycoon nodded slowly. "I understand, but you shouldn't have stopped. You have something special." He reached into his pocket and handed her a card. "I own a few art foundations and music halls. I can arrange for you to play again if you'd like. Not for charity guests or hotel crowds, for yourself." Lena stared at the card. It felt unreal. She didn't know what to say. "Thank you," she finally whispered. "That's very kind. But I don't know if I can. I haven't played in so long." He smiled faintly. "Maybe it's time to start again." Then he nodded politely and left. For a long moment, Lena stood there staring at the card in her hand. The logo was printed in gold, the name of one of the biggest music foundations in the city. She slipped it carefully into her pocket and went back to work, her heart beating faster than before. That night, after her shift ended, she sat on a park bench outside the hotel. The city lights shimmered across the river nearby. She took the card out again, turning it between her fingers. Could she really do it? Could she start again after all these years? She closed her eyes and thought of her father. He used to sit by her side while she practiced, always smiling, always proud. "Never stop playing no matter what happens," he used to say. "Music keeps your heart alive." Tears welled up in her eyes. She missed him so much. The next day, she made a decision. She walked to a small second-hand music store she knew from years ago. The owner, an old man who still remembered her, looked surprised to see her. "Well, if it isn't the little pianist," he said with a grin. "Been a long time," she smiled. "I'm looking for a keyboard. Something small, not too expensive." He helped her pick one, a simple digital piano. It wasn't much, but it was enough. When she brought it home, she set it up in the corner of her small apartment. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the first key. The sound was thin, electronic, but it was music. Night after night, she played again. At first, her fingers were stiff, her timing off. But slowly, the old rhythm returned. She practiced quietly, sometimes until midnight, letting the music fill her tiny space. It was like she was breathing again for the first time in years. A week later, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, a calm voice said, "Hello, this is from the Donovan Music Foundation. Mr. Donovan mentioned you might be interested in performing at our upcoming community concert. Would you be open to that?" Lena froze. Her heart pounded. "Perform?" She repeated. "Yes," the woman said. "It's not a big stage, just a small event to support local artists. But we'd be honored if you could play." Lena hesitated. Fear and excitement battled inside her. After a long pause, she said softly, "Yes, I'd like that." When she hung up, she sat quietly staring at the keyboard. She could hardly believe what was happening. From a waitress at a hotel to a performer again, it felt impossible. But maybe, just maybe, life was giving her a second chance. In the evenings after work, she practiced harder. Her fingertips ached, but she didn't care. She wanted to be ready, not to impress anyone, but to prove something to herself. Days turned into weeks. The concert drew closer, and while she didn't know it yet, the night she would step onto that stage would not just change her life, it would change how people saw her forever. Because sometimes, one small act of courage, even when forced, can awaken something powerful. And in Lena's case, the sound of those piano keys was not just music. It was the sound of a lost dream finding its way home again. The day of the community concert arrived faster than Lena expected. Weeks of quiet practice had passed like a blur. Every night after long shifts at the hotel, she came home, made herself a cup of tea, and sat by her small keyboard. Sometimes her fingers hurt. Sometimes her eyes grew heavy, but she kept playing. Each note was like a small step back toward a dream she thought she had lost. On the morning of the event, she woke before sunrise. Her heart was already beating fast. She looked out the window at the pale sky and tried to calm her nerves. "It's just music," she told herself softly. "You've done this before." But deep down, she knew this wasn't just about playing. It was about facing her fear, the fear of being seen again. She put on a simple blue dress she had saved for special occasions. It wasn't fancy, but it made her feel confident. After tying her hair neatly, she looked at herself in the mirror. For the first time in years, she didn't see the tired waitress who rushed through life. She saw someone she used to know, the girl who once dreamed of filling concert halls with music. At the small concert hall, musicians were already setting up. Some tuned their violins, others warmed up their voices. The atmosphere buzzed with quiet excitement. It wasn't a grand event, just a local performance where artists and students shared their talent. But for Lena, it felt bigger than anything she had done in her life. A woman from the Music Foundation greeted her warmly. "You must be Lena," she said. "We're so happy you could join us. Mr. Donovan told us about your performance at the gala. He said it was unforgettable." Lena smiled shyly. "That's very kind of him." The woman handed her a schedule. "You'll be performing last," she said. "We always save the emotional pieces for the end." Performing last. That meant everyone's eyes would be on her. Lena felt her stomach twist, but she nodded. The rehearsal time passed slowly. She sat backstage watching others perform. There was a young boy playing violin with shaky hands, a middle-aged man singing an old song with such passion that a few people wiped their eyes, and a small choir that filled the hall with soft, hopeful harmony. Lena clapped for each of them, her heart swelling with admiration. Everyone on that stage had a story, some hidden, some visible, but all of them had something to say. She realized then that music wasn't about perfection, it was about truth. As her turn grew closer, she took a deep breath. Her palms were cold. She rubbed them together, whispering to herself, "It's okay. Just feel it. Just play." Finally, the host called her name. The audience applauded politely as she walked onto the stage. The lights were soft, not blinding like at the gala. The grand piano waited in the center, shining gently under the spotlight. She sat down, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. For a moment she couldn't move. The silence stretched. Then she took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. The first notes were soft like whispers. They floated through the hall and settled into the air. Slowly, she began to lose herself in the music. Her body relaxed, her fingers flowed naturally. The melody she chose wasn't complicated. It was one she had written herself years ago, when she still believed in her dream. It was a piece about longing, about love and loss, about finding strength in pain. Every note carried a part of her story. As she played, the noise in her mind faded. The audience disappeared. There was only her and the piano. Her hands moved with grace and emotion, and the melody began to swell, rising and falling like waves. People in the crowd leaned forward, drawn in by the honesty of her sound. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It felt alive. When the final note faded, the hall was silent for a long, breathless moment. Then came the applause, slow at first, then rising until it filled the room. Lena looked up, blinking back tears. For a second, she couldn't believe it was real. The faces in the crowd weren't mocking her this time. They were smiling, genuine, warm smiles. When she stood and bowed, she saw someone familiar in the back of the hall. Mr. Donovan, the Tycoon. He wasn't in his usual expensive suit. He was dressed simply, standing near the exit, clapping quietly. But there was something in his eyes, something Lena hadn't seen before. Respect. After the concert, people came to greet her. A young music student said, "Your performance gave me goosebumps." Another older woman said, "You made me remember my husband. He used to play that song every morning." Lena thanked them softly, her heart full. Later, as the hall emptied, Mr. Donovan approached her. "You were incredible," he said quietly. "You have no idea how many people you moved tonight." "Thank you," she said, still shy but smiling. He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "I meant what I said before. I can help you continue this if you want. We can sponsor your lessons, help you perform at bigger events. You don't belong behind trays and tables, you belong behind a piano." Lena looked down, unsure how to respond. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of life again," she said softly. "It's been so long," he nodded. "That's for you to decide. But if you ever want a stage, you'll have one." He handed her another card, this one with his direct number, and left quietly. Lena stood there for a while, watching the empty seats, listening to the faint hum of the lights. Her chest was full of emotion she couldn't name. Gratitude, fear, hope, all mixed together. When she finally stepped outside, the night air was cool and calm. The city lights reflected on the wet pavement. She walked slowly, holding her small music folder close to her chest. She thought about how strange life could be. A few weeks ago, she was serving drinks at a party. Now she had just performed on stage, all because one man had mocked her into sitting at a piano. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was life's way of giving her a second chance in disguise. When she reached home, she placed the music card on her small table. She didn't call the number right away. Instead, she sat by her keyboard again and started playing softly. The notes came easier now, freer. She felt lighter. Days turned into weeks again, but something had changed inside her. At work, she moved with a new calm. She smiled more. The other staff noticed. One of them said, "You seem happier lately." Lena nodded. "Maybe I am." In her free time, she played at the local community center. Sometimes children gathered around to listen, their small faces lighting up with curiosity. Other times, elderly neighbors came by and hummed along. Music, she realized, wasn't about fame or money. It was about connection, about making people feel. One evening, as she finished playing, an old woman approached her. "You should record your music," she said. "People need to hear it," Lena laughed gently. "I don't even have a good piano, let alone recording equipment." The woman smiled. "You have what matters, the heart." That night, Lena couldn't sleep. The old woman's words echoed in her mind. She looked at Mr. Donovan's card again. Maybe it was time. The next morning, she called the number. A calm voice answered. "Donovan here." "Hello, it's Lena," she said nervously. I'd like to take your offer. I want to learn again." There was a pause, then a warm tone in his reply. "I'm glad you called. Let's make it happen." Within a week, the foundation arranged a meeting with a professional piano instructor. When Lena met her, she felt like a child again. nervous, eager, and full of hope. The instructor listened to her play, then smiled. "You have something rare," she said. "You play with honesty. That's something no one can teach." Lena felt her heart swell. Each day after work, she went to lessons. Slowly, she improved. Her fingers grew stronger, her timing more precise. She began to rediscover the language she thought she had forgotten. Months passed. Her confidence grew. And then one day, the foundation invited her to perform again, this time at a much larger venue. As she looked at the invitation, she felt a mix of fear and excitement. It was happening again, only this time not by chance. This time she was ready. The weeks leading up to the next performance passed in a blur. Lena's life had completely changed. She still worked at the hotel, but now her evenings were no longer spent cleaning tables or folding napkins. Instead, they were filled with hours of practice in the music room of the foundation. The first few days had felt strange. The building smelled of polished wood and sheet music, the sound of piano scales echoing through the hallways. It had been years since she'd been in a place like that. The instructors were kind, patient, and professional. They didn't treat her like a waitress pretending to play. They treated her like a musician rediscovering her craft. Her teacher, a soft-spoken woman with sharp eyes, often told her, "You don't need to be perfect, Lena, you just need to be honest." And every time she said that, Lena would nod, letting the words sink in. Because that was what music had always been for her, honesty. At first, she practiced simple exercises. Then, as her hands regained their strength, she moved on to more difficult pieces. Her instructor encouraged her to try something new, something she could call her own. So she began writing again. Late at night, she would sit by her small keyboard at home, exploring melodies that came from her heart. One evening, as she played quietly, her phone buzzed. It was a message from the foundation. "You have been selected as the closing performer for our Winter Arts Gala. Congratulations." Her fingers froze. She read the message twice, then 3 times. The closing performer. That meant she wouldn't just be one of many musicians. She'd be the one to end the night. The one everyone would remember. Excitement mixed with fear. This wasn't like the small community concert. This event would be big. Hundreds of guests, sponsors, journalists, and critics. And somewhere in that crowd would be Mr. Donovan, the man who had unknowingly changed her life. She turned off the keyboard and sat quietly for a while. The thought of standing in front of so many people made her heart race. But then she remembered the feeling she had at the first gala, the moment when the whole room went silent, when the music had taken over and drowned out everything else. That was the feeling she wanted again. From that night onward, her days were filled with practice. She woke early, worked her shift at the hotel, then went straight to the foundation. Sometimes she played until her fingertips felt numb. Her instructor watched her closely. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she warned. "You need rest too." "I can rest after the performance," Lena said with a small smile. As the gala drew closer, the organizers asked her what piece she would be performing. She thought long and hard, then decided to play an original composition, a piece that told her story. It was something personal, something born from her years of silence and rediscovery. The night before the performance, she barely slept. She kept hearing the melody in her head, like a soft echo that refused to fade. She imagined the faces of the people who would be there, the polished guests, the curious journalists, and maybe even a few of her co-workers who had promised to come watch. The next evening, she stood backstage at the concert hall, wearing a long silver dress borrowed from the foundation. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked around. The place was breathtaking. Tall golden lights, red velvet curtains, and rows of seats stretching far beyond what her eyes could count. Behind her, the other performers finished their pieces one by one. The sound of applause rose and fell like waves. Then the announcer stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing through the hall, "to close our Winter Arts Gala, please welcome a remarkable pianist, Lena." The lights dimmed and she walked out slowly. The piano sat in the center of the stage under a soft white light. She could feel hundreds of eyes following her every step. As she sat down, her heart pounded so hard she could hear it over the silence. For a brief moment, fear nearly swallowed her. What if she failed? What if she froze? But then she looked at the piano and remembered the little girl she used to be, the one who dreamed of this exact moment. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes were quiet and gentle. They sounded like a whisper, like the beginning of a story told softly to a friend. Slowly, the music grew stronger. The melody carried memories of her father's laughter, of long nights working under dim lights, of that humiliating moment when she was forced to play in front of strangers. Yet this time, it wasn't pain she felt, it was freedom. Her fingers moved effortlessly, the melody flowing through her like a heartbeat. Each note told a piece of her journey, the loss, the silence, and finally the rediscovery. The music rose higher, brighter, until it filled the hall completely. The audience sat frozen, their faces lit by the soft glow of the stage lights. No one whispered, no one moved. Even the air seemed to stand still. Then, as the final note faded into the silence, Lena lifted her hands off the keys and sat motionless for a moment. The hall remained quiet. It was the same kind of silence she had once feared, but now it felt beautiful. Then the applause came. It started softly, then grew louder, stronger, until the entire hall was clapping and cheering. Some people stood up, others wiped their eyes. Lena looked out into the crowd and saw Mr. Donovan among them. He was on his feet, clapping with the others, his expression filled with pride and something almost like emotion. She stood and bowed deeply. Her heart was racing, her hands shaking, but she felt lighter than ever before. After the performance, she was surrounded by people congratulating her. "That was breathtaking," one woman said. "You have a rare gift," said another. Her instructor hugged her tightly. "You did it," she whispered. "You found your voice again." Lena smiled through her tears. Later, when the crowd began to thin, she walked to a quiet corner of the hall to catch her breath. That's when Mr. Donovan approached. "You've come a long way," he said softly. "I wouldn't have if it weren't for you," she replied. He shook his head. "No, you would have. I just gave you a small push. The rest you did on your own." They stood in silence for a moment, both remembering that first night at the hotel. "I'm sorry for how it started," he said finally. "I was arrogant. I thought I was giving you a joke, but you gave the world something real." Lena smiled faintly. "Sometimes good things come from bad moments." He nodded. "You're proof of that." Before he left, he handed her a small envelope. "This is from the foundation," he said. "It's not much, but it's to help you continue. You've inspired a lot of people tonight." She thanked him quietly, holding the envelope close. When she finally returned home that night, she sat by her keyboard again. The stage lights still danced in her memory, the applause still echoing faintly in her ears. She opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from the foundation. "We believe in your gift. This is a scholarship for your continued studies in music. Congratulations." Tears filled her eyes. She placed the note beside her keyboard and whispered, "Thank you." For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was chasing something. She had found it. The next morning, she went for a walk by the river. The city was waking up, the smell of bread from a nearby bakery, children running to school, people rushing to work. She smiled at the thought that somewhere, someone might still be talking about her performance from the night before. She wasn't famous. She didn't have millions watching her, but she had done something that mattered. As she stood by the water, the sunlight reflecting off the waves, she realized that sometimes life doesn't give you one big miracle. It gives you small moments that build into something beautiful, like notes coming together to make a song. And though she had once been a waitress serving the wealthy, she now served something far greater, music that touched hearts, even if just for a moment. Lena closed her eyes, breathed in deeply and smiled. This was her new beginning. The days after the gala felt like a dream that refused to fade. Everywhere Lena went, she carried that same quiet happiness inside her. Even when she walked back into the hotel, wearing her uniform again, people looked at her differently now. The same co-workers who once teased her now greeted her with smiles and curiosity. "You were amazing," one of them said while wiping down a table. "I saw the video on the foundation's page. You made everyone cry." Lena laughed softly, embarrassed but grateful. "I didn't mean to make them cry," she said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Well, you did, in a good way," the co-worker said. Even the hotel manager, who usually walked past her without a glance, stopped to speak. "I had no idea you could play like that," he said. The foundation called earlier. They said you're receiving a scholarship. That's quite something, Lena. She nodded humbly. I'm just lucky, she murmured. But deep down, she knew it wasn't luck. It was years of silence, hard work, and small chances that had brought her here. Still, even with all the new attention, she tried to keep her life simple. She continued her shifts at the hotel, still served coffee, still smiled at the guests. But every evening after her shift ended, she went to the music room. It had become her second home, the place where she could breathe. Weeks passed. One evening, as she finished her practice, her instructor entered the room holding an envelope. "This came for you," she said, handing it over. Lena frowned slightly. "From who?" The woman smiled. "A music academy in Vienna." Lena's eyes widened. "Vienna?" She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," her instructor said. "They saw your performance online. The foundation shared it with their partners abroad. They're offering you a chance to audition for their scholarship program." Lena stood there frozen, staring at the letter as if it were made of gold. Vienna, the city she had once dreamed of visiting as a child, when her father would tell her stories about famous pianists and grand concert halls. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a formal letter with the Academy's seal. It read, "We were deeply moved by your performance and your story. We would be honored to hear you play in person." She looked up, her eyes full of disbelief. "This can't be real," she whispered. Her instructor smiled. "It is, and you deserve it." That night, Lena walked home slowly, the cool air brushing against her face. The city lights blurred in her eyes, but she didn't care. She clutched the letter tightly against her chest. For years, she had watched others live their dreams while she cleared tables. But now, something inside her told her that life was finally giving her a chance to live her own. The next few days were a mix of excitement and fear. She began preparing for the audition, knowing that this might be the most important performance of her life. But travel wasn't cheap and her savings were small. When she looked at her account, reality hit hard. She couldn't afford the flight, the stay, or even the basic expenses. For a while, she considered giving up. Maybe the dream was too far. Maybe it was meant for someone else. But then she remembered what her teacher had once said. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be honest. So she decided to try anyway. She started a small fundraiser online, sharing her story in simple words. "I used to be a waitress," she wrote. "Then I was given a chance to play the piano again. Now I've been invited to audition at a music academy in Vienna. I just need help to get there." She didn't expect much, but within a few days, messages and small donations began pouring in, from hotel guests, co-workers, and even strangers who had seen her performance video. "You made me believe in second chances," one donor wrote. "You reminded me why I love music," said another. Within 2 weeks, she had enough to cover her trip. The night before her flight, she packed her modest suitcase. Inside it were her few clothes, the letter from the academy, and a worn photograph of her father sitting by the piano years ago. She placed it carefully between her music sheets. The next morning, she boarded the plane with a mix of fear and wonder. It was her first time leaving the country. As the plane lifted off, she looked out the window, watching the city grow smaller beneath her. When she landed in Vienna, everything felt unreal. The streets were lined with old buildings, their windows glowing softly under the evening sky. Street musicians played violins on corners, and the air carried the sound of music everywhere she went. The next day, she arrived at the academy. The building was grand, tall columns, wide staircases, and walls filled with portraits of legendary composers. Her hands trembled as she walked inside. The receptionist guided her to a waiting room where several other applicants sat quietly. Some looked confident, dressed in expensive clothes. Others, like her, looked nervous but hopeful. When her name was finally called, she stepped into the audition hall. A long black piano stood in the center of the room. Behind a table sat 3 judges, their faces calm but unreadable. "You may begin when ready," one of them said. She took a deep breath, sat down, and placed her fingers on the keys. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes and thought of everything that had brought her here. The hotel, the embarrassment, the applause, and the letter that changed her life. Then she began to play. The melody she chose was the same one she had played at the gala, but this time it carried even more emotion. Each note was full of gratitude and longing, hope and courage. It was her story, told not in words but in sound. As she played, the judges leaned forward slightly. One of them even closed his eyes, listening intently. The hall was silent except for the soft hum of the piano. When the final note faded, Lena kept her hands on the keys for a moment, letting the silence speak for her. Then she stood, bowed slightly and whispered, "Thank you." The judges nodded politely. "That was beautiful," one said. "We'll be in touch soon." She left the hall with her heart racing. Outside, she sat on a bench, her hands still trembling. She didn't know if she had done enough, but she knew she had given everything she had. A week passed. She spent the days walking through Vienna, visiting small cafes and listening to local musicians. Every time she saw a piano, she felt an ache of belonging. One afternoon, as she sat by the river watching the boats drift by, her phone buzzed. It was an email from the academy. Her heart skipped. She opened it slowly. "Dear Lena, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected to join our upcoming program as a full scholarship recipient." She read the sentence again and again until her vision blurred with tears. She had done it. The next day, she stood outside the academy again, this time not as a visitor but as a student. Her dream had found a place to grow. That night, she called her instructor back home. "They accepted me," she said, her voice shaking. "I knew they would," her teacher replied warmly. "You were born for this." Lena laughed through her tears. "It still doesn't feel real." "Keep it that way," her teacher said. "Never let it become ordinary." Over the next few months, Lena poured herself into her studies. The classes were challenging, the competition intense, but she loved every moment. For the first time in her life, she woke up each morning excited to learn. Sometimes, when she walked through the grand halls of the academy, she still thought about her old life. The clatter of dishes, the sound of guests laughing, the soft hum of the hotel's piano. It all felt so far away, yet somehow it was still part of her, because that was where it all began. One evening, after a long day of practice, she sat by the piano in an empty room. The light outside was fading, turning the walls gold. She began to play quietly, not for anyone else this time, but for herself. Her music filled the empty hall, wrapping around her like a warm embrace. She smiled softly, somewhere in the quiet. She could almost hear her father's voice again. "Play like your heart is speaking, not your hands," and she did. As the last note faded, she whispered to the air, "I'm home." Months passed like a melody that changed with every season. Vienna had become more than just a city for Lena. It was now part of her soul. Every morning she walked through the cobbled streets to the academy, her music sheets tucked under her arm, her mind full of new sounds waiting to be born. She had grown stronger, not only as a musician but as a person. Her instructors noticed it too. "You play differently now," one of them told her. "Before you played with pain. Now you play with peace." Lena smiled at that. It was true. For the first time, her music wasn't about proving herself. It was about sharing something real. Her scholarship had given her access to the best mentors and instruments, but she never let success change who she was. She still lived simply, a small apartment, cheap meals, and long evenings spent writing music under the soft glow of her desk lamp. She wrote letters back home often, especially to her old instructor and a few co-workers who had supported her. Every letter she sent ended with the same line: "Tell everyone I'm still the same, just chasing bigger dreams now." One afternoon, while she was in the academy's practice hall, her phone buzzed. It was an email from the foundation back in her home country. She hadn't heard from them in months. She opened it quickly. The message was short but filled with warmth. "Lena, we're hosting a charity event to support young musicians from underprivileged backgrounds. The Tycoon who founded our program will be there. We'd be honored if you returned to perform as our guest of honor." She stared at the screen for a long time. Guest of honor. It felt surreal. She had once stood on that same stage trembling with fear, wearing a borrowed dress and hoping not to make a fool of herself. Now they wanted her back, not as a waitress or a hopeful amateur, but as someone who had inspired others. She took a deep breath, smiled, and wrote back, "I'll be there." The following weeks flew by in preparation. She practiced a new piece, something she had written herself, inspired by everything she had been through. It was gentle but powerful, full of light and hope. When she arrived back home, the city felt different. The streets, the cafe near the hotel, the scent of rain on the pavement, everything felt smaller yet dearer. The day before the event, she stopped by the hotel where she once worked. The lobby looked the same. Shiny floors, soft music, guests coming and going. The manager recognized her immediately. "Lena," he said with a wide smile. "It's been so long. Everyone's been talking about you since your video went viral again last month." She laughed softly. "I can't believe you still remember me." "Remember you? You made this place famous," he said jokingly. "The girl who went from waitress to world pianist. That's quite a story." She smiled but said nothing. Deep down, she was just happy to be remembered not for how she started, but for how far she had come. That night, she visited her old instructor. The woman welcomed her with a warm hug and tears in her eyes. "You look so different," she said. "More confident?" "I feel it too," Lena said with a soft smile. "But being here again reminds me where it all began." Her teacher nodded. "Never forget that. The roots make the flower beautiful." The next evening, the grand ballroom where the gala was held was filled again. Chandeliers shining bright, guests in elegant suits and dresses, cameras flashing softly. But this time Lena wasn't standing in a corner or serving drinks. She was the reason everyone had gathered. As she stepped backstage, a staff member approached. "The Tycoon would like to meet you before your performance," he said politely. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. When she entered the private lounge, she saw Mr. Donovan standing near the window. He turned when he heard her footsteps. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Time seemed to rewind, back to that awkward night when he had forced her to play in front of strangers. "You came back," he said finally, his voice calm but touched with something deeper. "I did," she replied gently. "Thank you for inviting me." He looked at her thoughtfully. "I should be the one thanking you. You've done more for my foundation than I ever expected. Your story inspired donations, new programs, and so many young musicians. You gave people hope," she smiled faintly. "Hope is what saved me too." He nodded slowly. "Do you ever think about that night?" "Sometimes," she said honestly. "It used to make me feel small. But now when I think of it, I realize it was the moment that changed everything. I don't hold anger anymore." A small, grateful smile crossed his face. "You've grown wiser than most people twice your age." She laughed softly. "Music teaches you patience." He chuckled quietly, then said, "I'll be watching from the front row tonight." "I'll do my best," she said, and walked back to the stage. When her name was announced, the audience applauded warmly. Many people already knew her story. The waitress who had once been forced to play, the girl who became a pianist and earned a place in Vienna's finest academy. She stepped into the light once more, the piano waiting for her like an old friend. She sat down, took a deep breath, and began to play. The melody started softly, almost like a whisper. It was a song about returning home, about finding peace after years of searching. Each note carried a memory, a feeling, a quiet truth. As she played, her mind drifted to her late father who had taught her first scale, to the hotel kitchen where she hummed melodies to herself, to the moment she almost gave up. But she hadn't, and now she was here, turning all those years of struggle into something beautiful. The music built gently, swelling with emotion. The audience leaned forward, listening closely. Some closed their eyes. Others wiped tears from their cheeks. Even Mr. Donovan, sitting in the front row, felt a lump form in his throat. When the final note faded, the room fell completely silent. Then the applause came. A wave of sound that filled every corner of the hall. People stood up, clapping, cheering, calling her name. Lena rose from the bench and bowed deeply. Her heart was full. After the performance, she was surrounded by guests who wanted to congratulate her. Reporters asked for interviews, photographers took pictures, and young students approached her shyly. One little girl tugged at her sleeve. "I want to play like you one day," she said softly. Lena knelt down, smiling. "Then promise me one thing," she said gently. "Never stop playing, even when no one's listening." The girl nodded eagerly, her eyes wide with wonder. Later that night, when the crowd had thinned and the lights dimmed, Lena stepped outside onto the balcony. The cool night breeze brushed her face. The city lights sparkled below, just like the first night she'd dared to dream again. Mr. Donovan joined her quietly. "You did it again," he said, his voice full of pride. She looked at him and smiled. "I didn't do it alone. I just followed the music," he nodded. "And it led you exactly where you were meant to be." They stood there in silence for a while, watching the city. Do you know what I realized? She said finally. It's not the applause that matters. It's the silence right before, when you can feel everyone's hearts listening. That's where music lives. He looked at her, moved by her words. You're right, he said softly. She turned back toward the lights and whispered, I used to think I wasn't enough, but maybe all we ever need to be is real. That night, when she returned to her hotel room, she placed her hands on the small keyboard she carried everywhere and began to write again. Not for fame, not for reward, but because that's what her heart needed. Her music drifted softly into the night. A song of gratitude, of peace, of homecoming, and somewhere, in the stillness between notes, she smiled, because she finally understood that life, like music, wasn't about being perfect. It was about being true.